Good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Cummings, and I'm the Assistant Director for Economic Development at Business Oregon. It's great to see so many people here, so many people I know, so many new faces that I hope to get to meet out in the hallway today. I want to just say this is the second day of the first annual Infrastructure Summit, and welcome. Who's ready to talk some infrastructure? All right, my standards are much higher than that. So I'm going to move you along because this is a key point of the day. If we start off great with some excitement, the rest of the day is going to be exciting. So I have a plan B. It revolves around chocolate because conferences, right, summits, and conference audiences, for that matter, are kind of like a box of chocolate, right? You don't know which one you're going to get. You could get that lovely one that has milk chocolate filled with caramel, or you get that weird one that's filled with that pink nougat stuff. And don't pretend you don't know what it is. It's the one that's left over at the end of the box with a bite out of it. So, to move us along, I have this wonderful C's gift certificate for a pound of chocolate. And I'm going to subjectively award it to whoever I want, who shows the most enthusiasm for being here. So, the big question of the day is, who's ready to talk infrastructure? All right. I do see the gentleman, which I will come and find you later after I eat some chocolate, and you will win a pound of chocolate. So why are we here? Why is this important? You'll hear about that after I speak. But I just want to give you a quick presentation on how we got here, because that's just as important. So about 15 months ago, one of my employees comes into me, a great employee, long tenured, has wonderful ideas. And I'm just sitting there in my office, minding my own business, watching reruns of The Simpsons, like most of us assistant directors do, because after the director directs, there's not a whole lot of assisting going on. And he says, Chris, I used to work at this place. I have a great idea. We used to do an infrastructure conference. And I said, the open door policy doesn't really mean to come in. I didn't say that, but I was thinking that. And I said, that's a great idea. Let me ponder that. Let me ponder that for a little bit. And then about 10 months later, another guy walks into my office. Let's call him guy number 2. And he says, Chris, I just went to an infrastructure conference. It was great. We should do one. I said, I was just pondering that. I said, but, because I didn't want to do anything with this, you need to find somebody in staff who's great at conferences. And that person needs to team up with you. I figured they'll never find it. So what do I know? The next day, he shows up with woman number 1, who's actually great at putting on conferences. She does them all the time. So I'm like, uh-oh, all right. I'll tell you what, if you guys can put together a crack team of stakeholders that are experts in their field, then we can have an infrastructure conference. And I figured out it's only 9 months away. They'll never do it, right? Next thing, I'm up here talking to you guys, right? So what I want to do is ask those people from that expert crack team to stand up. And also, guy number 1, who is Denny Hool, who works for Business Oregon. Guy number 2, Daniel Holbrook, who works for Business Oregon. And woman number 1, Karen Homelak. If you guys would all stand up, we'll give you a great prize. Thank you all, the planning team, those 3 folks from my team who put this together. I didn't have to do anything. It's wonderful. With that note, I'm going to pass this on to our director, Chris Harder, Business Oregon's director, and he's going to give you a little bit of a background of why we're here. So if we can have it for Chris Harder.
I had no idea Chris Cummings was our Forrest Gump handing out boxes of chocolate, so that's fantastic. I would also like to thank Daniel, Karen, Denny, and many others. I think one thing that's great about today and this conference is it really does demonstrate that leadership can come from anywhere in an organization. They are leaders day to day in their work, but clearly they brought together a whole host of people and demonstrating that leadership. So thank you for today. And man, the amount of work that goes into something like this is pretty astronomical. So very impressed and very pleased. So thank you. So greetings. Thank you for being part of the first ever Oregon Infrastructure Summit. Again, like to start by thanking Planning Committee, everyone who's been involved in making yesterday. The fact that you got about 200 people on a Sunday demonstrates the importance of this topic, and then certainly today we have a great agenda for us. So thank you for everyone who's been involved. I think it's probably fair to say that everyone in this room understands the importance of maintaining investments in infrastructure. Certainly at Business Oregon, infrastructure is core to our work, and it's particularly core in our rural communities across the state. The purpose of this summit is to exchange ideas and align priorities related to infrastructure investments to ensure healthy and competitive communities in Oregon. Alignment that will help advocate for funding at the local, regional, state, and federal levels. We also hope to emphasize the connection between infrastructure and community health, prosperity, and business growth. It matters to all of those areas. Pipes connecting water to homes, businesses, and land, roads, rails, and ports connecting rural economies to urban markets, and broadband connecting people and business to the world. The connectivity infrastructure provides is key for economic growth and prosperity, and I'm particularly excited about the variety of topics and sessions that we have on the agenda today. Given that we come from different backgrounds, different agencies, different sectors of government, private, nonprofit, and that means we have many different perspectives. And I hope and anticipate that our conversations will be robust, and it's okay if they're challenging as well. Key to addressing bold challenges and developing a shared vision is leadership. I'm honored that today we have the leader of our great state with us, Governor Kate Brown. Governor Brown has been a strong advocate for infrastructure development throughout the state, including funding in her budgets for transportation, water, and of course our own infrastructure programs here at Business Oregon and many other agencies. So with that, I'd like to welcome Governor Brown to the stage to say a few words and thank her for coming this morning to get us started on what should be a wonderful day.
It's a beautiful day.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that very kind introduction. And I don't know where Chris went, but I wish I could stay because I know I would win the C's chocolate. So, because I love chocolate and I'm very enthusiastic to be here with all of you this morning. I do want to say thank you. We have a number of other partners who played a role as well in having this conference come together. I have not seen John Huffman here from the USDA Rural Development. John, are you here? Let's give him a round of applause anyway. Our Oregon League of Cities, let's give them a round of applause. Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, our partners there. Oregon Association of Water Utilities. Oregon Metro. Northwest Environmental Business Council. Let's give them a round of applause. Woohoo! We come together today from many different organizations with one common goal, and that is to build a resilient infrastructure to ensure that we have a resilient economy moving forward. And I'm delighted to welcome you all here today to ask questions, to exchange ideas, and yes, to argue a little bit about the future of infrastructure in the great state of Oregon. Because it's truly the bedrock of our state. When working properly, infrastructure often goes unnoticed, but without it, we're literally in for a bumpy ride. Oregon's built on roads, bridges, and public transit, but these roads cut through forest lands, and those bridges bisect Oregon's many rivers and our streams. We're interconnected through the basic infrastructure of our state: broadband, watersheds, transportation, economic development, human services, natural resources, and more. For the last several years, we have sought to provide every single Oregonian with the opportunity to believe in the idea of a brighter tomorrow. A tomorrow that includes a stronger education system for our children, affordable housing, and access to critical health services. But it also includes key investments in infrastructure that improve and protect our state and allow Oregonians to access their schools, homes, and jobs. These investments reflect Oregon values. We believe that Oregonians can live in harmony with their natural surroundings. We believe in data-driven, proactive plans that lay a solid foundation for Oregon's future. And we believe that Oregonians are capable of doing great things when we invest in their everyday needs. Past approaches to infrastructure funding have generally been reactive rather than proactive, and I believe very strongly that we need to change that mindset, even if it's going to take some seized chocolate to make it happen. To think in far-reaching increments, much further ahead than most people ever have, whether that's for a decade or for a century. In short, we're looking to accomplish long-term change instead of solving short-term problems. Take, for example, Oregon's 100-year water future. A lot is at stake. We can no longer run away from climate change, especially when it comes to our diminishing supply of clean and potable water. And the citizens of the Marion County region know what I'm talking about. Oregon's water infrastructure has served us well, but it's certainly starting to show its age. We have to invest in natural and built infrastructure to meet current water challenges and adapt systems to meet our needs, not for the next 5 to 10 years, but for the next 100. We have to continue to grow and build infrastructure while also recognizing that we must steward our natural resources, fish and wildlife in this state, to preserve it for future generations. It's imperative that future generations be able to enjoy the beauty and bounty of Oregon. We have to create a vibrant Oregon for the next 100 years. We are certainly all frustrated at the chronic underinvestment in infrastructure at the federal level. If we can't count on the feds, and right now we certainly can't, it's time for the state and our local partners to step up and do what needs to be done. That means cool, clean water for both watersheds and water pipes. It means safe roads and bridges for communities from Baker City to Coos Bay and everything in between. It means rural broadband, a critical piece of 21st century infrastructure. Just as roads and bridges connect urban and rural areas, so do cable technologies. And it means resilient and redundant systems that will help us weather disasters, both natural and man-made. So my hope, my wish for you is you take advantage of what this summit has to offer, a chance to collaborate while you innovate. After all, it's not every day that someone asks you to spend an entire workday discussing the ins and outs of how efforts to expand broadband can affect watershed restoration. So let's get to it. We're counting on your collaboration and creative problem solving to build a better Oregon, literally from the ground up. Thank you so much and have a really great day.
It's a beautiful day. Sky falls, you feel like it's a beautiful day. So let it get away on the road.
All right, so thank you, Governor. There's certainly a different perspective from being up here. I went down to give away my gift certificate, and I approached the wrong guy. He's like, I didn't applause at all. Just so now I can see, and you know who you were. Now I can see. So I don't know how many people know this, but Oregon has an infrastructure report card. Actually, every state has an infrastructure report card, but there is one for Oregon. It's developed by the Oregon section of the American Society of Civil Engineers. And here to talk about this today, we have a gentleman from HDR Engineering. His name is Mark Libby. Mark has, it's in your brochure. When I say Mark has lots of experience, you just have to believe me. Take a look at your program. He's just wonderful, and he's going to come up and give us a presentation on Oregon's report card. Mark?
Thanks, Chris. Morning. Jump back. The American Society of Civil Engineers has been issuing a national infrastructure report card for some time as a way to bring attention to our needs throughout the country. Many of the states have been doing their own report cards, especially the last few years. The last one that Oregon did was 2010, and so we've been talking about it for a while, the need to update that. A team of 28 professionals in their disciplines came together. We selected 10 different categories, and so much select them, but that's where we could get the volunteers for. This is all volunteer-driven. People donating their time over a year to study their various disciplines, the infrastructure data available. Most of this information is available through public sources, but we want people in the industry that can reach out to their counterparts that know the ins and outs of what's going on. And many of these teams also reached out to others for peer reviews. And then our national society that does the report cards, they also review it, make sure that we're staying consistent with the overall trends, themes, practices. So there's 8 standard grading criteria that we go through for every category within there. There's 16 categories overall. Like I said, we covered 10 of them. So capacity, condition, funding, future needs, operation and maintenance, public safety, resilience, and innovation. So each of these are evaluated, data collected and sifted and scored. We use a typical grading scale, A through F. Now, given that we're dealing with infrastructure that's been around quite a while, there's no A's. Exceptional fit for the future, that just doesn't exist. And B is very, very difficult to achieve. But we also don't have that many F's. We're largely kind of a CD class when it comes to our infrastructure. So there's always a lot of work to be done still, but it's good to have a handle on just what is lacking, have a good assessment of what we're dealing with. So for Oregon, our average was a C minus. These are the 10 categories we looked at: bridges, dams, drinking water, energy, inland waterways, levees, ports, rail, roads, and wastewater. Now, I've only got a short amount of time, so I'm just going to give a very quick summation of what we had, but I did bring a few of these summary report cards, and they're out on the Business Oregon table. And so I don't know if I have enough for everybody, but also at the end of this, there's a link. You can search online, just look at infrastructure report card. You can go to the national website, scroll down, there's a map, click on any state, and get access to their current report cards and the summary. And the Oregon one there, it's a light, breezy 100-page or so document. You can get into the particulars of any given category that you want more detail on. So for bridges, we got a grade of a C. The main reason it's not lower is this chart here showing our structurally deficient bridges, which mean it's really in poor condition, not able to carry the loads, is lower than the national average. So that's really kind of good. And the national folks said, you really can't score lower because you're not in that category. This chart here is showing, so the blue bars are structurally deficient bridges. The orange ones are the ones that are about to become. They're rapidly approaching that as they're aging. And we have this large group of them, about 20%, that's on the verge of becoming that. So the reason for a potentially lower score would be that we're so close to that tipping, but we're just not there yet. Here we're showing a comparison. Oregon is on the left, but to other western states. So the little red band, that's the good news, is we don't have that many that are in poor condition. The big yellow band is the fair condition. That's not so good because the green is shrinking. It's been cut in half over the last 10 years. We're not replacing our bridges at a rate sufficient to maintain 10% in good condition. So the transportation bill in 2017 helps, did quite a bit, and one of the things we're really pleased with is they were looking at that more long-term. It's hard to get legislators, to look beyond the 2-year windows. They were really pushing for a 20-year type of funding. And so it helps on the bridges, but in our evaluation, we're now up to about 120-some million a year, and it needs to be about triple. When you combine the age, degradation of our bridges, and then our seismic issues, there's a lot really needed to be done with bridges. Dams are D+. Little 880 dams in the system that we know of. Most of these are regulated by the state. Large majority of them are irrigation related, and most of those are earthen dams. But they're also quite old, and there is a shortage of the ability for the dam inspection program, and more to be known with the dams. Now we do have them. Here's a map of basically the dams throughout the state. The reds are the high hazard dam. A high hazard dam, high hazard potential dam, if it fails, has the potential of loss of life as well as significant property damage. The yellow or significant hazard does not include the loss of life aspect, but significant economic or property damage. And then green is a low hazard potential. Drinking water, it's a C-. 80% of Oregonians get their water from a public system, 20% on private wells. Again, what's in the ground, a lot of it's old, and keeping up with that is an ongoing challenge. And a growing population, increasing demands. We've seen a lot of water projects recently, so that's good news that there is some funding going there, and some of the entities are working that. Energy, our energy team took a big bite at things. They didn't just look at electricity. A lot of our energy is electricity driven. They also looked at natural gas and liquid fuels. For each of those, they evaluated the generation, transmission, and distribution, as these all are different parts of the system. Generally pretty good on electricity, also natural gas. Liquid fuels is the struggle. Now this is where I have to ask whenever I'm doing one of these, how many of you have seen the OPB documentary Unprepared? Not very, okay, you're a typical crowd. You should be ashamed of yourselves. You need to go Google Unprepared. It's a 50-minute, well-made documentary that OPB did now 5 years ago or so. It's been a while. Does a really good job of taking a look at Oregon and the earthquake hazard that we're facing, compares it to Japan and how they fared, and they were very prepared. We're not prepared. You'll see in that, several of our ASCE members are in that video, and you'll see there why liquid fuels is so bad. So there's your homework assignment. Go watch that. This chart I find interesting. It's sort of the distribution of our energy sources. We're blessed in the Northwest. We're in the top 5 of renewable energies, top 3 for hydroelectric. What really surprised me is the black circle there is coal. And the Boardman coal plant, which is the only one left, is set to be shut down by the end of next year. And I don't know that it's really producing that much. I was also surprised that hydro wasn't larger. But part of it is that all our generated electricity doesn't stay here, and much of our electricity comes from elsewhere. So a lot of the coal may be from other states. So our grids are rather interconnected, and there's a lot of shared distribution throughout the Northwest and and elsewhere. So that's kind of why those look bad. And then, again, this was a 3-year average from 2014 to 2016, so it's probably a little different now. Inland waterways is vital to our economy. The Columbia and Snake River systems convey an awful lot of product to market. The amount of jobs that are supported, and then $3.6 billion to our economy, it's pretty significant. There's just a graph of the Columbia Snake River system. And I'm always amazed at some of the stats of how much stuff we pass through our system. So the deep draft portion of the channel only comes up to about the Portland, Vancouver area. The rest of it's only a 14-foot draft, at least what it's maintained at. There might be areas that are deeper than that. And so there's considerable need. Maintaining that 43-foot deep draft section is an ongoing challenge, but it's also not enough to bring in larger ships. So now there's a lot of these the Supermax and what are these massive things. We're not getting any of those. It would take an awful lot to make our channels deep enough for that to produce it. So, but just maintaining the level that we have is an ongoing challenge of keeping up the dredging and all that. Levees, a D plus. 100,000 Oregonians live or work behind levees, the protected systems. The Corps of Engineers reviews a lot of them, but there's a big gap in what we know about a lot of the levees that aren't maintained. There's a lot of diking districts that are responsible for the maintenance and review of the levee systems. The big ones, of course, along the Columbia, whatnot, the Corps of Engineers manages those, they inspect those. There's some state agencies that have some oversight, but they're really strained on their resources. I think there's 2 people that have involvement there, so it's a little bit limited. Ports, a C minus. Ports are also very critical to our economy in Oregon. Picture showing we got the 14 coastal ports, 9 along the Columbia and Willamette. The amount of revenue coming through our ports, and this one stat always throws me: 1 in 6 jobs in Oregon connected to activity at the ports. I mean, that's a significant amount of connectivity from those entities to the rest of our economy. They struggle with a lot of the typical maintenance things. It's a common theme through all of these categories is funding challenges, maintenance challenges. The larger ports tend to do a little bit better than the small ports. They have a little larger revenue, so they tend to have a little bit better maintenance aspects. So, but it's common issues with the challenge side of it. Rail is in quite good shape. The rail's about as good as it's been for a long time. About half of the trackage in Oregon is Class 1 railroad, so that's Union Pacific and BNSF. The lion's share of that is Union Pacific. The rest of it is the short line, Class 3 rails, and those are kind of the feeder lines, the collector distributors. They freight it into the main lines. See the map here showing the yellow is the UP's track, green is BNSF, and the little gray lines, those are the short lines that are feeding into the mainline tracks. And if you're near any of those, you'll see there is a lot of activity on those rails. Most of the Class 1 track has the positive train control aspects on it. Most of it can carry the double stack containers, but there's some sections that don't. Quite a bit more on the short line side that can't take the standard 286 skip rail cars or double stack containers. So those are some of the limitations on being able to get more throughput. But I'm always sort of amazed. I see those long double stack trains going, and you just think, man, how many trucks is that taking off the road? That's a lot of throughput. Roads was our highest grade with a C+. So the road condition is generally pretty decent. Biggest surprise out of this to me was BLM has the largest number of miles of road in Oregon, more than ODOT. Now, it's probably not true for lane miles, but for just on mileage of road, BLM comes out on top. Then ODOT's next. 81% rural, 19 urban, so there's a pretty good mix there. The choke points in Oregon are all up in Portland, the big ones anyway. That's a lot of what got addressed in the transportation bill. There's a lot of focus on the congestion and trying to mitigate that. The Rose Quarter project, Abernathy, I-205 project, 217. Those projects are all underway, thanks in part to funding from that transportation bill. I hear the Interstate Bridge project is being talked about again, so that's good. But Portland ranks 20th in the country, 11th for cost, so it's costing us a lot to sit there. Then this chart is just showing the general pavement conditions. So with only 10% in poor for ODOT in most of the counties, that's pretty good shape. Portland's got some work to do to kind of get their maintenance backlog caught up. So wastewater is our lowest grade. They got a D. A lot of the systems are pretty old. There's a lot in the ground that's over 100 years. The amount of additional water they get from infiltration, especially in the wintertime, all of the rain, it's like up to 20 times what they're designed for, gets pumped through there. We've got about 30% of the households on septic. The rest is on sewage systems, but that's there's just again lots of need. A lot more need than there generally is resources. So that's our main thing. You probably can't read the tiny print here on this one, but overall on our report card, so every one of these chapters has a list of raise the grade solutions in the full report. So we go through each of those categories, give some background and context and explanation of what's going on. Then each of those has recommendations for improvements for raising the grade for those. Overall, as the report card as a whole, we listed 3. The number 1 is predominantly improve our infrastructure for resiliency. The focus of the Cascadia Subduction Zone event. This bridges across all of the infrastructure categories, is that none of them are really in good shape for that type of seismic event. Number 2 is prioritizing investment in the bridges. The bridges are critical when it comes to maintaining lifeline access, getting services out there after an event. We're going to have a big challenge with bridges and landslides on the road side of things. But bridges can really cripple your connectivity and links. And as we saw earlier, we're kind of falling behind on the need for replacement and improvements there. And then lastly was to get a little more dedication to the Connect Oregon program. It's been a successful program over the years, but lately funding has not really been there so well. 3 of our categories, ports, inland waterways, and rail, all benefit significantly from those programs. There's other things it funds as well, but that interconnectedness of our various infrastructure types is really important and critical, and so we need to be able to get some of that infusion to help those smaller entities that are struggling to do a little better. So infrastructurereportcard.org/Oregon. You can find the whole report. You can find a digital copy of the summary one, and while supplies last, you might find one out on the table. So thank you very much.
So that's a good discussion point. Where do we want to be as Oregon? Where do we want to be collectively? Do we aim for all C's, right? Get to C, right? Is it possible? Obviously, Mark had said not many A's, so maybe we don't want to get too crazy, right? But something that we might be able to collectively come up with. Before we get into our next speaker, I just want to see, is there anybody in here, there should be, from Jacobs Engineering? Anybody here? They, just so everybody knows, they sponsored these sessions here with these speakers, and I'd like to give them a round of applause. As you can tell, I like to clap. So our next speaker is going to talk about climate change. I think we probably all heard about climate change. If you haven't, maybe you should go outside. It's kind of a hard thing to grasp, right? We have climate change, or folks, we talk about climate change, but how do we work that into our asset management? How do we work it into our infrastructure planning? And really, that's a hard bridge to gap because of the way our financing works and the way, of course, our just daily lives work in our workplace. It's sometimes difficult to step back and look at that. So our next speaker is Dr. Jesse Keenan, who actually, I don't think he drove. I think he flew all the way out here from Harvard University, and he's going to give a talk on climate change and our asset management and how we can tie those together. Dr. Keenan.
Thank you very much for having me today. I want to talk about the fact and fiction of public investments. And I do want to acknowledge a number of people in the state of Oregon who've pioneered and played important roles in engaging infrastructure and climate change. Mike Stewart, Portland Water Authority, Jay Raskin, and a number of others who for a number of years have served in the various components to advance this work. With climate change, we have two options. We can mitigate and prevent greenhouse gases, and we can adapt, prepare for, and respond to climate change. Within the broader field of climate adaptation, we have two categories, general categories, resilience and transformative adaptation. This is pursuant to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the global consensus body for general standards associated with knowledge in the realm of climate change. Now, among resilience, there are different types of resilience, different categorical variants of resilience. We have engineering, disaster, ecological, socio-ecological, urban, and in community. And these range along a continuum from single equilibrium, that is the elasticity or the reversion to the status quo with single equilibrium, and multi-equilibrium, the idea of possible multiple stable states. And along the same continuum, we run from descriptive to normative. And that is the sense with single equilibrium, we can describe and we can measure the performance associated with resilience. And on the normative, we have a better understanding of, we think about how things ought to be in that sense. And this is very important from a financial point of view because associated with, let's say, single equilibrium disaster, primarily disaster resilience rather than engineering resilience, we internalize that value. And it's the externalities, and it becomes much more difficult in many ways when we begin to think about normative understanding associated with urban and community resilience. So across all of these aspects of resilience, we can have synergies and we can have conflicts. In this sense, and I think many of you can understand, that very often we have conflicts between engineering resilience and ecological resilience, for instance. But primarily when we're talking about infrastructure and we're talking about resilience, particularly in the context at which brings us here today, it's about engineering resilience. It's the single equilibrium, it's the descriptive aspects from which we can measure. Now, when we think about the elasticity of the reversion, particularly as it relates to infrastructural systems, we can think about designing failure, brittle failure, graceful failure, ductile failure. This is part of the engineering process. And we have different types of responses. And this is where resilience may actually be adaptive and maladaptive. Not all investments in resilience are actually leading towards adaptation. There are many, many examples from which resilience investments may lead to maladaptation. So we have to think critically about where we're heading in many ways. So if you think about aging effects within the life cycle, and here we're thinking in terms of cost optimal or cost optimization associated with the life cycle of a particular engineered asset, among various different resilience options, if we invest in an option that gets us to a state of performance that's inferior to its aging effects or inferior to where it should have been otherwise prior to a perturbation, that, in fact, may be maladaptive, right? So if we're making investments to be worse off than we would have otherwise been, the future perfect cost of the dollar, if you will. This is, in fact, a resilience investment. It's probably likely a poor investment. But if we're making investments in resilience that are actually extending the useful life of this particular asset, and again, remember, this is quite critical when you're thinking about useful life, because many of you can recognize that you make your yield or you have optimal economic performance at the end of a useful life. So every month, and this is true certainly when you're paying off debt, every month, whether it's revenue side of things or just the absolute economic utility of it, every month, every year counts when you're maximizing and optimizing for extension of useful life. Now, one of the important things to think about is that when you're doing an analysis and you're thinking about making investments in resilience and adaptation, you have to be precise about actor orientation, time horizon. You can think both in adaptive and maladaptive terms, and you can set up both synergies and conflicts by between multiple types of resilience. What you see here is engineering resilience and community resilience. And I think one of the things that we'll speak to today, hopefully throughout, is the very multitude of values that are derived from engaging various constituencies and stakeholders across agencies in making these types of investments. But this is a very common set of trade-offs. And I think many of you could understand here where we have a local government, we have a time horizon, maybe an annual tax assessment or a credit rating outlook, a piece of hazard mitigation infrastructure may be stabilizing a tax base, but it may often represent a very inordinate burden in terms of O&M and long-term capital planning, and may actually limit various options for alternative investments in the future. And from an engineering resilience point of view, it has enhanced protection, but that enhanced protection may be limited, right? So resilience is actually has functionality to known phenomena, and there are limits to resilience. And from a community point of view, it may stabilize that community, but it may represent an undue tax burden. I think that was a set of trade-offs that we saw quite precisely yesterday when we were looking at associated utility rates yesterday afternoon. So setting up these stakeholder analysis, these trade-off analysis to understand time horizons, stakeholder orientation, where is community resilience, engineering, and ecological resilience in agreement, and where do they diverge? That process of trade-off analysis is really critical to moving forward in terms of project plan development and option analysis among alternative options. Now, adaptation and adjustment, this is coming from the IPCC, and adjustment in natural human systems, yada, yada, moderation of negative effects. But adaptation itself has limits. No adaptation is free. All adaptation, and certainly resilience, has costs. There's technological limits. But very often what we're doing is we're optimizing. We're making a set of economic optimizations that, of course, do not reflect the political reality of the mobilization of infrastructure. And I think it's also worth recognizing that adaptation has another component to its definition. It's not just about the moderation of negative effects. It's also about the exploitation of the beneficial opportunities. In this sense, we can begin to set up adaptation as a set of strategies. And I think it's quite important when you're thinking about the broader portfolio of investments that you understand what it is that you're trying to do. We have a no-regret strategy, a flexible, reversible strategy, safety margins, soft strategies, and things like a reduced decision horizon. In this case, we're simply trying to buy time until we have to make more fundamental decisions. And so it's both a matter of making investments, it's also disinvestment strategically, and I'll bring this up later with strategic obsolescence, and sometimes it's just a matter of buying time. And so understanding among these various strategies where you fit in and bringing some transparency to that is associated with the proper stewardship of financial investments. And I think it's often worth reflecting on a very simple relationship, which is that our immediate impetus is for stability and certainly continuity of performance. But we have to understand that resilience has a threshold, and at that threshold, one either fails or you adapts. So understanding the limits of resilience is really quite critical, not from just a life cycle point of view, but from the underlying full range of multi-hazard, both stresses and shocks. And in fact, much of the work that we do for the U.S. Department of Defense and others looks at the interactive and stochastic relationship between shock and stress in terms of critical facility performance. So I want to lead off today's discussions and dialogue with a couple of axioms that I think are maybe some measure of provocation for future discussion. One is there's no such thing as a resilient or adaptive project. There's nearly 3 decades now of empirical empirical and observational research looking at different types of resilience and adaptation projects. None of them, very rare, are they single purpose or are they organized, driven, engineered, designed, financed with the intent of being resilient or adaptive. It's really quite rare. The fact of the matter is, most of the projects are just regular capital investments in projects that have some resilience performance and some designed adaptive capacity to them. And this is really critical, I think. Sometimes people struggle looking for the resilience project, looking for the adaptation project. And really what this is about mainstreaming these considerations into everyday capital planning and project design. This reflects the political reality of multiple policy goals with multiple benefits. And so the question then, there's several questions, and one question is, how do we then pay for the incremental cost of resilience performance and adaptive capacity? And so I think it's, one, we have to ask, when it is necessary to invest, when it is not, when we should not invest or disinvest very often. And second, it's about creating new value. And so I apologize, I know that anytime someone brings something up from California, it lacks in translation. I find the state fairly annoying myself sometimes. It feels like a policy behemoth, and I think you can disregard California from the title here, and I think this work applies and is quite generalizable. Thank you to the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, who sponsored I serve as a visiting scholar, and I have to say in that capacity I'm speaking my individual capacity, not on behalf of the Federal Reserve, but thanks to their generous contributions, they bought the copyright. You can actually download this work for free. And I think it's important because, one, it brings analytical clarity. We very often conflate the difference between risk mitigation, resilience, adaptation, failure. Failure can, in fact, indeed be a good thing under some circumstances. It walks you through different scenarios why this language matters, both conceptually and analytically. It sets up a series of paths and a series of processes from which we can think about asset management, and we can think about the documentation and the sensitivity. So if we think about a totality of vulnerability associated with exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, it walks us through, from an asset management point of view again, how do we document this? How do we proceed under various different types of asset classes? Part of this is setting forth a life cycle priority definitions. We saw the gradations from A through F here, but there is a fair amount of work globally in setting up life cycle priority definitions for public assets. We have to triage. We simply don't have enough money to go around, and triaging and disclosure is quite important. In fact, this afternoon I think Bloomberg will be running a piece on this to that very point. Thinking about reserve accounting, so this isn't just major investments, it's taking care of what we have. How do we utilize best available science and applied science in the interest of modifications of reserve accounting? Particularly from an O&M point of view, this is really quite critical, both OpEx and CapEx. Thinking about fat tails, and as we have a shift in mean, we have a shift in the distributions associated with extreme events. What does that mean from an economic point of view? How do we internalize that in terms of risk, volatility, and pricing so that we can engage not just public resources, but private sector financial instruments in underwriting larger and larger conduits for public finance? One additional thing that it goes into is impact variable investment analysis. How do we underwrite an investment today that may not necessarily completely work out in your best interest as a return analysis, but we know given certain probabilities or range of assessment and modeling may very well work out much sooner or later, and certainly within the useful life of the particular asset. How do we think about that? How do we walk through that with a level of analytical precision? Of course, understanding these volatilities and variability within timing and sequencing is important. We highlight other emergent activities associated with things like microgrids and ESCOs, energy service companies. We talk about cat bonds and resilience bonds. While the nomenclature may be popularized in many ways, it's not quite ripe for engagement. We talk about why these good ideas are not quite yet mature for market utilization. And fundamentally, we provide some mechanisms for thinking about project screening, option analysis, thinking about criteria and multi-criteria weighting for how do we approach this money, what are we giving up, What is the duration? What is the conflicting public policies? What's the administrative costs and overhead for this? What are we getting versus what are we getting versus what we're getting up? Yesterday afternoon, I really enjoyed yesterday's afternoon session. I think it was Seal Rock in Canyonville. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I apologize. There was a very simple trade-off there with certain requirements for Buy American versus other trade-offs. All kinds of trade-offs in terms of what you're making in terms of access to capital versus certain types of requirements. And I think all of this has to be included, and this is coming from the city and county of San Francisco when they're putting in a couple $2 billion seawall. They went through about 40 different sources of funding, created a weighting mechanism so that they could make these trade-offs from themselves in the administrative capacity. And I think one thing is worth recognizing, Oregon, like many other states, has a lot of small municipalities and townships that really just don't have the capacity administratively to engage very large units and very large grant programs and the like. And I think what I heard yesterday was really quite impressive from the state in terms of the one-stop shop. And it is impressive what Oregon is doing. Many states do not have that opportunity to project manage that and to help small governments, and it's something that you should be proud of. There's other considerations here like social equity, and I think this in many ways raises the bar in terms of political and stakeholder engagement, but thinking about the utility function associated with granting of dollars, how do we internalize that both into cost-benefit analysis and cost-effective analysis? And the methods that we provide, you can do in an Excel spreadsheet. This is not overly complicated economics, although I want to acknowledge one of the sponsors here today from, I believe, it's Economics Northwest or Northwest Economics. There's a tremendous amount of environmental and climate services providers here in Oregon that really do wonderful work. This is really one of the top states for those types of service providers, many of whom I saw were participating today. But you're thinking about, in this case, by example, 2 different levies. What is the associated impact and how does that play out ultimately in terms of cost-benefit analysis? Developing these equity weights are, in fact, accessible ways in compliance, certainly with OMB documentation. There are accessible ways to think about what are the equitable distribution of resources. We talk about the private sector and how this is playing out currently with disclosure, of course, with the bottom line. How does this affect bottom line? How do you engage it from a management point of view? There's much to be learned there, I think, in terms of local governance. We also talk about the provision of climate services and the multitude of climate services available to local governments, particularly those smaller governments. There's a lot of technology. There's much happening. I think we understand the parameters of scenario planning and scenario analysis that drives much of the early stage development in terms of climate vulnerability assessment. But in a recent piece that I published in the journal Science, we know that there's an arms race, and we know that there's a climate intelligence arms race. And I think one of the challenges for state and local communities is how do we engage these climate service providers with not in our best interest? Because there's good science, but there's also the misapplication of science and applied science in terms of commercial interest. So how do we develop bodies of oversight that really provide the best mechanisms for making sure that we are moving forward in a way that's consistent with global scientific methods, models, and the like. So there's much to be challenged there. Certainly this is in the interest of a global financial community to get this right, but it's going to take some time, and I think there's some substantive policy challenges ahead. So I'll conclude with a couple of considerations. One, I think we talk about climate change, but we have to understand that this should be contextualized within the broader realm of global change. So when you're thinking about an aging society, you're thinking about shifting demographics, you're thinking about technology, shifting labor force, all of this is certainly caught up, certainly the rapidity of it is caught up in our understanding of climate change. So when you're thinking about ratepayers, you should also fundamentally be thinking about demography and other aspects associated with mainstreaming housing and other economic development considerations. There's a certain paradox here as a consumer or taxpayer. You're going to pay for it one way or the other. And that's a fundamental decision of public policy going forward that is a real consideration. This extends certainly between public sector debt and public sector equity. There is a fair amount of money. First of all, there's more money in the world than we could possibly spend. And there is a lot of money that will be coming down the pipeline in years as we develop better networks and conduits for reaching small borrower, or I should say smaller borrowers in terms of infrastructure finance. And this is going to come with some real trade-offs. And I think that, again, we have many public policy decisions ahead of us. But the accounting rules, particularly there's recent GASB interpretations, Government Accounting Standards Board, and other public accounting rules, and other activities associated with credit rating agencies where the market itself is catching up quite quickly. So the question is, are you going to have the determination to get ahead of this, or is someone else going to force place certain activities and requirements on you? And this is the real urgency, because I don't think you want to be put in a position where Moody's or Fitch or some other credit rating company, agency rather, is going to come to you and say, you know what, we'd like to give you a good rating, but we can't because you failed to do this because X, Y, and Z. You should have done it 10 years ago. I don't think we want to be looking in that perspective. The upside is that a number of different states are moving forward with trust funds within their states, in California, Massachusetts, and Florida. We really sort of pioneered this body of work in the state of New York and in California. These are references for you to look at, the idea of what these trust funds may do, how they may be, how various products may be developed, and how they can support capitalization of projects. There's other micro considerations, things like climate gentrification. There are indeed downsides to resilience investment in terms of how they may impact and disproportionately impact various communities. There is public policy versus market behavior, the ideas of blue lining and underwater writing. These are real parts and components of our lexicon now that are describing behavior associated with markets, again, having negative effects or having positive effects depending on how you look at it. As we move in the National Insurance Flood Program and other programs, we are going to see quite a real reckoning both in the mortgage and insurance markets associated with prior risk-taking. There are financial path dependencies. I referenced that earlier in terms of thinking about the degree to flexibility and investment and disadvantage. We have very practical problems in terms of procurement and multi-jurisdictional projects. How do we get small towns to cooperatively work together? This is a challenge I think many of you can recognize. Within the world of community development, and I'll end here, there's a number of resources we've published recently. I would encourage you to look through these. They're setting off different trade-offs. It's helping you think through more resolutely between resilience and adaptation under different scenarios. We just last week released the Community Development Innovation Review that I think is worth looking at. It is a significant compendium that I think has a lot of relevance for you when you're thinking about the interaction between climate change, the built environment, affordable housing, infrastructure, and all of these issues that will circle around. But I will leave you with this, which is that this is New York City after Hurricane Sandy. This building that has its lights on, it's Goldman Sachs. People are making money from climate change. The level of sophistication around a financial economy associated with climate change is significant. And there are questions that you will have to make about making investments. And certainly one argument that we can make is that being here today is a significant step forward in getting ahead of this prior to a foreclosure of options that you may have in the future. So thank you very much for having me.
All right, so we're going to take a very short break. We need to change the stage around, get ready for the next group. So just be back here in, 30 seconds? Oh, 5 minutes at the most. Thank you.
Hello, testing. Am I on? Good morning, everyone. Woo! That's loud. I'm going to call folks back from their break. We were worried we'd lose a lot of people. Come on back. Bring your coffee. Yeah, we'll have more time for networking as the day goes on. Very good. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us at Oregon's first Infrastructure Summit. It's a pleasure to see so many longtime colleagues and friends here in the room for this. I'm Brenda Bateman, and on behalf of Business Oregon, we'd like to welcome you all and thank you all for being here this morning. This morning, we are talking about infrastructure resiliency, and we've got a great panel of folks that we're going to get to here in just a moment. But I wanted to start by hearkening back to the governor's comments this morning. She talked about the importance of long-term, 100-year planning for our future for infrastructure. And with regard to water, much of that work is going to rest on a foundation that the executive branch agencies and their partners have been working on for years. I brought with me this morning a copy of the state's Integrated Water Resources Strategy, and I recommend it to you not only because it's a beautiful document, but also because it contains scientific and policy recommendations that talk about how to prepare for the future of Oregon's water data, its water infrastructure, and its water funding. Many of the case studies and pieces that are in this document you'll actually hear from this panel this morning. So we've gathered with us 4 experts who come to the conversation of infrastructure from 4 very different perspectives and different lenses. You'll hear about infrastructure with regard to capacity, technology, water, transportation, and communities this morning, and we're very excited to share what these 4 folks have been working on in partnership with their communities. When we got together on the phone and started planning this, we talked about the concept of resiliency being the ability to recover quickly from challenges or from disasters. And as we talked about it, we decided this isn't apocalyptic stuff. This is everyday stuff. This is the ability to keep up with technical changes and population growth and workforce needs and maintenance needs. These are everyday things that we need to be working on all the time. So this morning we have 4 folks with us. We've asked them to start with their elevator speech, about 5 minutes worth of the project that they're working on and some of the highlights that they want you to know and take away. And then we'll follow up with a series of questions. We decided a discussion was better than a round of PowerPoints this morning. So, sorry, I was supposed to put up my moderator slide. We're going to start with Danielle Gonzalez, who is from Marion County, and then we'll move across the panel, going next to Tim Gross, who's with the city of Newport, and then Bruce Zimmerman, who is with the Confederated Tribes. 2 are in the wrong spot. We're going to hop to Ramona Cohen, who's with Stillwater Energy, and then we'll end with Bruce Zimmerman, who's with the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. So let's get started with Danielle. I'm going to hand you the clicker. It's the big green button there that you want, and give us your elevator speech.
Yeah. So thanks, Danielle Gonzalez, Marion County. And so what I would like to start with exactly what the guy from Harvard said. That's what we're doing. So isn't a really big word, so let me tell you what it looks like actually on the ground, because this is what we're actually working on in the North Sandium Canyon communities. So community building is resiliency. Let's start there. And when you have communities that sit right next to each other and they don't communicate, you can pretty much assure that any distress that they're going to experience, they're going to become competitive against each other. And so we talk about community building around economic development goals. This is something that I wish that more communities would do. Instead of siloing pipes into public works, we're looking at it from an economic development perspective. How do you actually bring communities together to do big things? Now, the communities I'm working with, I will tell you, they are tiny. So the full-time population for IDANA is 140 full-time people. City of Detroit, that I know all of you have probably been out to Detroit Lake, a full-time population of 210. Gates, a little bit over 460. Mill City, big city, 1,869. So why do you even care that economic development is involved? Well, here we go. There's a porta potty right there next to the one store in IDANA. There is now also porta potties across the street from City Hall in Detroit. And there's porta potties there also in Detroit at Mountain High Grocery Store. So during winter months, these businesses and these have to actually pump their septic tanks up to twice a month. In communities where they make most of their money within 2.5 months in a year during a recreation season, pumping your septic tanks is quite costly, and it might actually take your business out. So why are we talking about infrastructure? Because we're talking about it from an economic development perspective. So community building does provide a map to economic prosperity. You start with the community, you build on the trust of the community, you'd be surprised what you can do. In March of 2017, I started working with the communities of Mill City, Gates, Detroit, and Idana to take on a $60 million estimated price tag on a sewer project among 4 communities for less than 5,000 people. So how do you do big things when the finances, the financial picture really doesn't make any sense? You gotta be creative. And so that's what we've tried to do. This is the first meeting, one of the first meetings in March of 2017. You can tell on that they still hated me. So you've got arms crossed, you have people that do not wanna be there, but they knew that they had a problem, and so they came together to try to solve it. So this is October of last year. This is us looking over giant maps of where we actually want to include, what we want to include in the sewer authority. So as you can see, they're not even paying attention to me at this point. They're actually working. I'm the one that's too busy taking pictures just to say, did this really happen? It does. And this actually was April of this year. They received their first grouping of money from Marion County for them to get some legal advisement so they could move forward on setting up a sewer authority. So I want to just put a plug out there. I'm going to be talking about the North Santiam Joint Sewer Project at Economic Opportunities Beneath at the next session. But big things can happen in small communities. As you can tell, it does not happen overnight. But they've gotten to a point where they're starting to trust each other so much that they're starting to drive each other to the meetings. So big things can happen in small communities.
Good morning. My name is Tim Gross. I'm the Director of Public Works and the City Engineer for the City of Newport. And Newport is one of the co-conveners in the Mid-Coast Water Planning Partnership. And you're probably wondering what in the world that is, but the Mid-Coast Planning Partnership is one of 4 regional areas that were chosen to do a pilot plan for regional water planning called place-based planning. And it's one of the strategies that was identified in the Integrated Water Resources Strategy back in 2015. And this is a map that shows the 4 regions that were selected. And really what it is trying to do water planning at the local level. Instead of the state dictating to a state that's very diverse and has a lot of different water issues, rather that planning would come from the ground up. And you would develop a community plan that you'd work at together. And so we're structured in our planning group. We've been going now for about 3 years. We have our overall larger planning group that we call our planning partnership. And then there's a planning team. It's consisting of 4 co-conveners. The City of Newport is one of those, Oregon Water Resources Department, Sierra Rock Water District, and Gibson Farms. And then we break down and work in working groups. And this is what I want to talk to you a little bit about today, is that work that we can do on the local level to help develop resiliency and redundancy within our water systems. Our planning partnership has about 200 people that sign up for information on our partnership. And that can be anybody across the state, and actually I think the nation too. People are trying to figure out what we're doing. And we have over 100 people that have signed our charter. And we have about 60 to 70 people that show up at our large group meetings. So this has a lot of initiative. People have really invested in this. And the reason for that, and I truly believe that the single largest threat to infrastructure resiliency is time. We don't have the time to do the things that we know we need to do. And so therefore, this planning partnership has created a forum for us to talk with each other. It's become important enough that we're willing to take the time to communicate and work together to do those things that we can't do on our own. And one of the working groups is called our self-supplied working group, and it's comprised of different water providers in our region. And we've been working very closely together to try and advance initiatives that we couldn't do on our own. And there's several examples of things that we've done. One, for example, is an interconnection between the City of Newport and Seal Rock Water District to the south. Everybody in our area has typically been working sort of in a silo from a water supplier perspective. We work on our own infrastructure, we maintain our own infrastructure, we do what we need to do to provide for our communities. And over the course of the past several years, we've been able to realize how we can help one another to provide redundancy within our water systems. And out of that stems the interconnection between the Seal Rock Water District and the City of Newport. Now, Newport is by far the largest water producer in the Central Oregon coast and our mid-coast area. And so we can send water to them. They can't necessarily send water to us other than our South Beach area. But we've used that intertie several times and been able to provide water for each other when our own sources have run dry from, landslides or whatever the case may be. We also, out of our self-supply working group, have developed a conservation consortium comprised of different communities up and down the coast, so we can provide common messaging for conservation and curtailment. And you might be wondering, what does that have to do with redundancy and resiliency? Well, when your water supply is threatened because of drought, having common messaging for your communities is very, very important. Because if you go into any one of our small towns, most of the time those people have absolutely no idea where their water comes from. You might have a Newport mailing address, but your water comes from Beverly Beach Water District, for example. And by common messaging, we're able to provide the same message to the same people, the same message to people across all of our water districts, so they have an understanding about how our region is functioning at that moment. There are several users that come off the Siletz River: the City of Newport, the City of Siletz, the Siletz Tribe, Georgia Pacific, the City of Toledo, Seal Rock Water District. And when the Siletz is threatened, we work together to try and provide that common messaging so people understand that it's not just one community or another whose water supply is threatened, it's our region. And then finally, it's about education. The reason that I thought it was really important for the City of Newport to pursue the grant to help develop the Mid-Coast Water Planning Partnership is because we were making decisions in a silo. And I didn't understand how the decision that I was making was influencing my neighbor, because I didn't know what my neighbor was experiencing, because we never had the forum to talk about those issues. And so what the Mid-Coast Planning Partnership has done is it's created this forum for us to talk about water holistically in our region, how we manage that effectively, safely, efficiently, so that when we need to take more water to provide for our community, we understand how that affects the cultural resources of the Siletz tribe. We understand how that affects the economy in Georgia Pacific. Resiliency and redundancy cannot be done in a silo either, because the decisions that we make to provide for our communities influences our region. And so the planning partnership, as well as the other place-based planning groups that are working across the state, are beginning to understand how important it is to balance those decisions in light of all the impacts that those decisions may have. And this is the tool that we've been using to do that. As I'd mentioned, time is the enemy of resiliency, because I think we would all do many great things if we all had the time to do it. And this is the tool that we've used in the Mid-Coast to make the time to make good decisions. It's our excuse, and we have been successful because we've made it a priority. And I would encourage the state to continue to advance funding into place-based planning, because I really truly believe that that's the best tool for effective water planning in the state, because it meets communities right where they're at, and it helps them to make good decisions in light of the overall impact of water in their region.
Testing, all right. My name is Romana Cohen, and I'm with Stillwater Energy, and I work very closely with the Energy Trust of Oregon. So, and on behalf of the Energy Trust in Oregon, with some of the largest commercial customers of Energy Trust all over the state. I was going to say, next slide, please. So, strategic energy management, the fancy term is that it's a management system essentially for energy. Just like safety, we think about really integrating energy into the entire organization, whether it's a for-profit or nonprofit. We work with a lot of municipalities. We work with the largest commercial customers as well as the largest industrial customers. So the question this morning that I was pondering, someone mentioned earlier, how do small communities stay connected, and small cities in rural Oregon, and really build long-term relationships that persist through regional high school football rivalries, competition for resources? How do we build those relationships? And this program, Strategic Energy Management, is a program offered by the Energy Trust of Oregon that brings together these customers in a cohort-based model. So the organizations meet 5 times a year in the more rural parts of the state, and more often in Portland, and have workshops, full half-day workshops, calls with other organizations monthly, and are working on the foundations of a strong energy management system. So writing an energy policy, building an energy team, and then actually doing a lot of projects. The focus of strategic energy management is operations and maintenance projects, so low cost, no cost projects. So we're talking a lot today about large capital projects, and this program, I would say, is very complementary to these capital, large resiliency infrastructure programs, in the sense that a couple of things, and I'll tell you this actually through looking at one of the organizations we work with, the City of Talent. The City of Talent, how many people have been to the City of Talent? Can you raise your hand? All right. Good to hear. Just north of Ashland on the I-5 corridor, or just off it. And it's a small city, but they're doing a lot of pretty advanced work in climate change. And specifically, they are aggressively targeting to become a community that has integrated energy into their comprehensive plan, which is pretty powerful for a very small city. They're part of our cohort, and a couple of things that they've done here, or how they use strategic energy management to support infrastructure projects. First, they are getting great energy data and modeling their buildings, and then everyone in their public works department is able to tell a powerful story about where they're using energy and why, and then can get more support for large capital projects. The second thing is they're actually just lowering their operational costs, which then they can divert to other projects in the long term. And the third is really by building partnerships with other municipalities and other organizations, they're able to tackle some larger projects. So a couple of things they're working on in the near future, have been working on and continue to work on, are EV and solar for their municipality from some of the resources they've gotten through this program. The other interesting thing about talent, and when we think about people, our theme has been people so far. I'm gonna click here to show you the favorite pocket protector that I've ever seen, I think, in my life here. And this is one of the customers that we work with. And as you can see, in his pocket, he's got a flashlight, he's got some diagnostic tools, he's got a lot of pens. I don't know how many pens one really needs. But the metaphor here is really that we can sit around in suits and talk about, long-term strategic thinking around infrastructure, but the program that we work with and the work that we can all do is to engage every single member of our staff on your facilities team and your public works department to use strategic thinking and look for opportunities to save energy, and to use this systems thinking approach. So this gentleman is walking around every day in every space in a building, and is able to see some of the missed opportunities and wasteful things that are happening, and often doesn't have the voice or the support to get those projects done. So I don't know, my message, I guess, is thank your facilities team for working so hard, because through proper maintenance of your infrastructure system, you don't have to build a new project, and you can really maximize the one you've got. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Bruce Zimmerman, and I work for the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, and I'm in the Department of Economic and Community Development. And our department is responsible for the planning, construction, and paying for basically all the infrastructure on the reservation. Once that infrastructure is deployed and put into service, of course it goes out to the various programs like Public Works and so forth that then operate it. So, but I thought I would start with real quick, kind of explaining a little bit about who we are and that we're really no different than a lot of other small communities. There's about 3,100 tribal members. The reservation itself is fairly large. It's 172,000 acres, or about 270 square miles. It consists of basically farmland and forest land, and it's mainly agricultural based. We employ about 1,800 full-time employees with an average annual payroll of about $40 million. When you look at that, the actual population of the reservation is about 4,000. And so we have 1,800 full-time employees that live or work or commute to the reservation. So transportation is an absolutely critical factor for us. Our annual operating budget is about $250 million. Now that seems like a lot of money, and it is. I don't want to diminish that, but you have to take into context that that includes a whole host of services. We operate like a health clinic. We operate a high school, daycare, preschool, full-time police force, full children's and services, tribal court. So a lot of those services, the funding coming from that is from grants from the federal and state governments to operate those governmental programs, as well as contracts. We're one of the larger contractors with the Bonneville Power Administration, doing a lot of environmental work for them. We do a lot of cultural surveys for them. We do a lot of biology, fish habitat. We have numerous fish hatcheries. So a lot of those funds are contract in nature, is that the revenues come out and flow directly out to provide those services. Wanted to show you, here's what our community looks like. There's a picture of the reservation. I do want to emphasize that this picture was taken probably in April because everything is green. What you're looking at, those green fields are actually wheat fields, so starting about May, June, they start turning golden brown and stay that way for the rest of the year. But that's our community. As you can see, it's not a high population density area, and that does make a lot of challenges for us when we're providing the infrastructure and services. The reason I wanted to show that picture, that's exit 216 on I-84. That is basically the entrance into the reservation area. That is the lifeblood of the reservation as far as economic development and the employees getting to and from work. And so the infrastructure is very important to us. I do want to say that as far as our public transit system go, we do operate a bus system. Our bus system is not like you would see in Portland or Salem or Eugene. Our bus system is designed to go to rural areas. We go to Pendleton. We go to Hermiston, which is about 35 miles away. We go all the way over to Boardman. We go up to Walla Walla in Washington. We go over to La Grande. We go down to Pilot Rock. And we try to run at least 3 to 4 times a day into those areas. One of the goals we're trying to do is provide service for the employees. Like I said, we have about 1,800 employees that work full-time for the tribes. We did an analysis, and the majority of our employees are commuting approximately 40 miles one way to work. And so we were trying to help as the cost of fuel's going up. How do we provide that service? Well, how do you provide it and at a cost-effective way? And so that's been one of our challenges, and I don't think that's a unique challenge to our community at all. We actually did an analysis and determined that it was actually more cost-effective not to charge than it was to charge for ridership. So it's a free bus service. We don't charge. We noticed the one improvement we made to the buses and shuttles that we run that provided a big bump in ridership was when we added Wi-Fi to the buses. And we noticed that all of a sudden when we offered free Wi-Fi service, suddenly we had much more individuals wanting to ride the bus and commute. The other thing is we noticed when we had the air conditioners fully turned on in the summertime, we had a lot more ridership as well. I think people were just, instead of walking around, they were hopping on the bus to cool down, I think is what was happening. But no, it's been a huge success for us. But the challenge is always money when it comes to public transit systems, as well as other infrastructure projects. So it's a combination of we get money from the federal government to operate that system, we get money from the state, as well as the tribal government kicks in a large portion of funding for that transit system. And it really takes a combination of all three. What do we see as one of our biggest challenges going forward is the price of fuel. What's going to happen with the price of fuel in the future, because our transit system is a high mileage, low volume, if you look at it that way, system, but it's absolutely critical to the success of our business enterprises and so forth. The other thing is I wanted to point out that we're not unique in some of our infrastructure desires and needs. We're currently looking at putting in a fiber optic broadband system, a fiber loop. Right now, we are out of capacity with fiber optics. The fiber optics were put in 1996 and 97 is the fiber we're currently using. And it's at an overcapacity. It's absolutely imperative that we improve that system and put that in. The next thing is our largest employer on the reservation is the Wild Horse Resort and Casino that operates a golf course, restaurants, and a hotel. We are currently expanding that. As we expand that, what we found is that we are having to increase the power, upgrade our electrical systems. We found out that our water system is insufficient, so we're having to put in a new well. And off that, I don't think anything is surprising. We're also looking at increasing in our wastewater treatment, improving the roads. Another two needs that we face, and this is not unique, that we are also challenged with, is how do you provide affordable housing and what we call workforce housing. And so we're not talking the low-income housing, but we're talking affordable housing where you have two individuals in a household working full-time, earning a wage, that really don't qualify for any of the housing subsidies or programs. How do you provide housing at a reasonable price that they can afford to purchase and live in your community? And the other thing goes with that, of course, is land acquisition. So I appreciate your time. And I just wanted to express my thanks to letting me come here and talk briefly, and just say that as we all face these challenges of infrastructure, if someone has a magic bullet, I'm all ears. I'd love to know what you have done to be successful in getting some of these projects financed, given the fact that typically your rate base or your customer base does not have the economic ability to pay real exorbitant rates, such as the project you described. If you price that out and had those ratepayers pay it, it would be astronomical and no household could afford it. So how do you get creative to get those rate structures that are reasonable, that you can maintain and improve the system, but also pay for the infrastructure? And that's a challenge we all face. Thank you.
Very good. Well, thank you to our panelists for that snippet of what they're working on and a little bit about their projects. You may have noticed that somewhere in there we turned the conversation from what was more hard infrastructure or solely infrastructure to a conversation about people and relationships. So I wanted to come back around and maybe hit that a little bit harder and ask each of our panelists. It seems like each of your communities is placing a premium on the people and taking time to invest in both the partnerships and the relationships that you're going to need for these projects as well as for future projects. So if we could maybe go down the line again one more time, I guess my question for you is why? How did you get there?
So I would say very honestly that Business Oregon kind of put us in a good spot to start out. Karen Homlock in particular, she's amazing, she's a rock star. So when we first got started with the sewer project, you know, this is a upstream water source for 225,000 people and probably the water you're drinking today. So having partnerships that are true and genuine has been the only thing that has moved the project forward. Very early on, we wanted to work with the North Santiam Watershed Council, so something maybe non-traditional that you would think, but building not just the engineering pieces of a sewer project, but also looking at what kind of multi-barrier approaches that we could take to handling sewer systems. So that has been really important to us. Working in the small communities, I mean, there's, so the one thing is I don't really communicate a huge amount in the communities. It's actually the community members that do that. And so they're reaching people that I wouldn't know to reach in their communities. So there's snowmobile club, there's Santiam Hearts to Arts group. Things that you wouldn't necessarily think, but they're all affected very specifically about the fact that they've had an inability to grow for the last 4 decades. And so, you know, we talked a little bit, in the gentleman from Harvard, he talked a lot about, you know, how you're talking about engineering and you're talking about disaster response, you're talking about the ecological pieces and all the way up to the community development. If you find that you can get partners in every single part of those, I'm finding that we're going to be much more successful. And so for us, it's actually been a very conscious work to be genuine and to be honest, because each one of those groups that we're trying to meet with, they have needs too. And so how do we then support their work that they're doing? You know, they talked a little bit about, you know, the environmental bonding and things like that. Well, with environmental bonding, it's a little difficult, but there are ways to fund some of these projects that are a little unique. That came to me from a trip that I took overseas, and then came back and talked with the Watershed Council, and they said, you know, we could maybe possibly look at maybe a water source protection fee, that we could start building then funds for the long term, so we can continue and make sure that these projects that we've worked so hard to get in place can be resilient in the 20 plus years. So for us, it's been a very conscious effort to find non-traditional partners.
So Public Works is aptly named because you wouldn't need infrastructure if there weren't people. And something I try and beat in the heads of my crew all the time is that you're there to provide for the people in your community, not just fix the infrastructure that's under the street. As part of our planning process, we work collaboratively, which is just a fancy word for saying partnering together. And we try and develop consensus over the plan that we're developing, which is just, most people don't say no. It's a good way of phrasing it. You know, we live in a litigious society, and traditionally, people duke things out in the courts, and especially about water. There's a saying that gets tossed around in the place-based planning community that whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. And the place-based planning process is to try and change that, understanding about water, is that you can have both a water supply and a healthy ecosystem. You know, if you ask somebody in the city if they want to destroy all the salmon in the river, they're going to say, absolutely not. We're concerned about the salmon in the river. But that could and very well be the perspective of that person who's trying to save the salmon in the river, is that the city's taking that water out and you're destroying the salmon. Well, if you don't understand the risk that that particular watershed has in regards to salmon, and you and the city side are trying to take more water without an understanding of that risk, then you're making a bad decision. And so working together collaboratively means understanding all the impacts of water within your ecosystem, within your watershed, within your community. And when you get together to work collaboratively to try and secure the water future for your community, as well as the water future for your ecology or your ecosystem, that's winning. And so the biggest challenge of our process to date has been developing trust with one another, because a lot of the partners we have in our partnership historically have been adversarial. I swear we were going to have fistfights in our first couple meetings. People were pissed. And they were sitting across the table from somebody that they've only sat across from the courtroom in. And it was a very different dynamic. And as we began to work together, we began to understand that everybody's interested in clean water. Everybody's interested in protecting fish. Everybody's interested in protecting the cultural resources of our local tribe. Everybody's interested in those things. And they all want to protect them, and they all want to advance clean and safe water for your community. It's just how you go about doing that. And instead of doing it by yourself, now you're doing it together, and that's messy. Super messy. But it can be done. And when our group has gotten the glimpse of that being successful, that's when they engaged. That's when they got really excited. And we keep pushing, because we will not fail, because we will keep moving forward to try and protect the water future of our community. And that's what place-based planning is all about.
I was going to say, for us working with our neighbor governments, such as the city of Pendleton, Umatilla County, even up in Washington, for us, those partnerships are absolutely critical. We don't have enough of anything to do it all on our own. And so, for example, we have mutual aid agreements in place with the fire departments of the adjacent jurisdictions. When they have fires, we respond. When we have a fire, they'll come out. We have public safety, police agreements in place. In fact, we even have a police agreement in place with the Union Pacific Railroad, because even though it's federal jurisdiction and they have their federal police force, they do not have enough patrol individuals to patrol their own railroad through the reservation. And so we've entered into an agreement to share policing activities and functions with the railroad. So for us, when it comes to forming partnerships, it's absolutely critical. We have agreements on water and sewer with the city of Pendleton, where we share a common sewer treatment processing facility. The reason why is, combined together, it gets enough of the volume and enough customer base up there to make it economically sustainable. Without us working together, it would not work. Neither party could afford to operate that system and meet all the federal and regulatory standards that are necessary. So partnerships we view as a great way to break down barriers, but we also view it as a great way of taking what resources you have and being able to extend those further.
How many people really are passionate about energy in the room? And it's okay, you don't have to raise your hand. In the work in looking at energy and trying to build partnerships and enthusiasm with municipalities and organizations, we find that energy doesn't always get people excited. Maybe at an academic way, maybe at a theoretical perspective, but you can't touch it, you can't see it. Why have I spent my whole career working on it? I don't know, right? But what we look at instead are the personal motivations for why would I be involved in something that is related to sustainability, which is sometimes a bad word. In cultures and communities, that doesn't always drive. Polar bears don't motivate everyone. Money can motivate people, but what we think about is what's in it for me. And so by participating on a team, you can have your day be a little bit more joyful. And in this dark and twisted world of climate change, by being able to control one small thing in your workspace and look at your plug load of your office cubicle, or be part of a longer term strategic plan to bring in solar and EV and reduce your operating costs of your building by 10%, that's something that people can get really excited about. So we start with the individual motivation, and then from there build relationships and have people connect to look at their passion on a team, a diverse team.
Very good. So here I'll give some advance warning to folks. I'm going to ask the next set of questions, and we're going to start at this end this time. And I'll also give advance warning to the room. If we have time at the end, we'd love to take a couple questions from the audience. Maybe we'll have Daniel run the microphone around. So be thinking about a couple of good questions to pose to the panel. So the last question that I have is really about challenges. I'm interested to hear what significant or interesting challenge you have overcome as part of this work, or possibly what you see looming in the future that you know you're going to need to work on.
So the forest fires in Oregon 2018 were pretty severe, especially in some of the communities we work in, Southern Oregon and Northeastern Oregon and the Pendleton area. And in Southern Oregon, we had 8 major fires that burned for multiple months with toxic smoke. It was, I think, the worst air in the country for a certain amount of time, a sustained amount of time. And so all of the good work we'd done around energy management was put on hold because every single community was trying to keep occupants safe and residents safe. And so all of our priorities shifted. So afterwards, we went back and looked and said, how can strategic energy management help support resilience in these communities during a pretty severe climate event? And a couple of ways. First is that the teams had already done a great job of looking at the building envelope, sealing cracks, looking at outside air and how it was getting in the building, and really just getting those operational systems ready to go for anything, knowing what could break and how to fix it quickly. In the middle of the event, the people that were already working on a team together, banded together, weren't able to respond quickly. And as well, they were opportunistic about how to get energy projects that had been on their laundry list, how to get those completed in a short amount of time, because they were also related to health and safety. So they were able to optimize the bundle projects and be strategic in how they accomplish that. And then lastly, afterwards, these organizations that have been working on strategic energy management already had a culture of continuous improvement and were able to rebound really quickly, as well as getting all their operating systems back in a normal operating procedure and really start saving energy again. So it was seemingly opposite priorities, but ultimately those organizations that were managing their energy wisely to begin with were able to respond more quickly.
I would say our two biggest challenges that we have can kind of be summarized into two buckets. The first bucket is human capital. We don't have on staff, or we don't have readily available to us sometimes the individuals that possess the skill sets necessary to assist with the development and design and engineering of some of our infrastructure projects. So we have to look outside and often hire those resources out. And I don't think that's unusual for any small community or any city or county at this time. The other part is money, is where do you get the funds to pay for the design, pay for the actual capital investment, and then pay for the operation and maintenance. And for us, I think we face a little bit further unique challenge in the fact that the tribe on the reservation has no tax base. I am the tax administrator. I do run the tax programs. However, our tax base is a very minor portion of the revenues that we use. So for us, we derive a huge portion of our funding from grants and contracts, but the other part that we use to fund our infrastructure is our actual business enterprises. That is our tax base in effect. 100% of all the proceeds derived from any and all of the businesses that we operate and own go right to the general fund. Those monies then are budgeted out to pay for those services, including debt service on infrastructure. So for us, it's really how do we create a positive environment that will enhance and attract business development for us, which is increasing effectively our tax base, that we can then derive those revenues from operating those businesses to pay for the infrastructure that is needed. And it's always that challenge of how do you get the thing kicked off? And we've been very fortunate that we have had very successful businesses and continue to try to enhance those. But it is a long-term process. It's not something that's done overnight. So it's a challenge. It's something we face every day and every year. As they go through the budget process, these issues come up. What else can we do to generate revenues to pay for services? So that's really a challenge.
So I would say without question our biggest issue is capacity. It takes a lot of work to work with people, a lot of coordination, a lot of time. Initially our planning process, we hired consultants to help us do that, to do facilitation and project management and develop our documents. Well, that became very, very expensive and couldn't support that. So we had a brief period of time where we were self-managed with our co-conveners, which we all are running, cities and water districts and farms, and that was just obviously not going to work. And now we've recently hired a planning coordinator to help us manage that busy work of bringing people together. And then there's the capacity of our partners. It has to be important enough for them to come, otherwise they have other things to do. And making this of value to them is very important to us, that they continue to invest their very, very precious time in something that they don't quite still know how it's going to turn out. It is an experiment, it's a pilot program, and I think, and we've been meeting with our other planning groups across the state and a learning partnership to sort of bounce issues, concerns, and ideas off of each other to try and advance each of our individual planning groups. And they have the same issue, it's capacity. Working towards something great takes a lot of time, and it better be worth your while, and I think it is.
And of course, I would agree on capacity first. That's really important. In our particular situation, we have a lot of regulatory hurdles that unfortunately the people that are actually getting the benefit, downstream water users, are not the ones that are necessarily paying the high price and the high premium. So there's kind of some environmental justice and environmental equity issues that we've got to deal with. So I would say regulatory hurdles. I would say funding, of course. So when you're encouraged to do the regional projects, but the reality is when the funding only matches what they would do for one city, it makes it really difficult to do a 4-city project. There's that, and then also we would like to be some more creative. There's ways that we can overlay and layer different projects together. So we can, while we're doing sewer, we can also add broadband fiber. Well, the broadband fiber funding is separate and it's in a different place, and so we would have to technically then go after 2 different forms of funding for really a same hole. We're going to be putting sewer pipes in. We just need 6 more inches to go ahead and put in conduit. So we'd like some creative problem solving when it comes to the funding piece and also the regulatory pieces. And I think that we could do some really big magical things. We've luckily for us, the county has been able to put a lot of resources into our project using economic development dollars. But capacity on the ground is really important too.
Very good. I think we have time to take a question or 2 from folks, and so I'll hand the microphone to Daniel if he wants to run around the room.
A question for Danielle. What economic impact would this have on the Santiam Canyon if we can get a sewer system put in?
So that is former Mayor Jerry Marr asking that question. Thanks for the nice one. I always love to talk about economic development and what it would mean for the canyon communities. So the Upper Canyon, Detroit, and Idana are completely surrounded by federal lands, and so they really don't have a way to grow out. They could potentially, though, grow up. A lot of the unutilized industrial and commercial lands is strictly because they can't even get permits. They can't get permits to even replace or fix their septic tanks. So for a economic development, what I'm looking at is there is a return on investment if we can invest in sewer and broadband infrastructure in these communities. If you add 10 jobs, I'll give an example. If you add 10 jobs in Detroit, it is equivalent to 22,000 jobs in Portland. That's a small community. 10 jobs is a big deal, and if they're only being able to do that for a few months a year, that's a large part of their economic picture. So, you know, we want to talk about scale in the right way. It's not going to look pretty on a grant application when I'm having to compete with, you know, some of the metro communities. But in cities like Gates, right now people could potentially use for housing. We could utilize both, where they currently have septic drain fields. Now you could potentially utilize that area. So individuals could better utilize it. The commercial and industrial communities could also use the land that's up there. And it just can't be used right now because of the sewer system.
This question is for Mr. Wasserman. Just want to point out, Hood River has an EV ride share that they're experimenting with. That might be something the tribe would have some interest in learning about. The electric vehicles don't have any fluctuation in prices on the fuel source, so there's an opportunity for collaboration there.
Thank you. Yeah, we are looking at alternatives as fuel prices increase, and no, all things are on the table at the moment.
Question for Romana. How long do communities spend in these cohorts, as forming the teams, and how do they get involved? Do they have to self-form, or does Energy Trust get them all together?
Thank you. So the first year is really building the foundational elements of your management system. Energy policies, building a team, hitting these different milestones that are each worth $1,000 for an organization, and many of those organizations then take those milestone incentives and reinvest them into their school districts or doing different occupant engagement activities. So the first year for really building that foundation, and then we have a lot of customers in Oregon who've been in the program for up to 8 or 9 years now. Since the program was started, so all over the metro region. We do have a couple of brochures at the back table there, but it's really, there's kind of a size threshold, so usually we are recruiting actively large customers.
All right, in the back.
So I have a question about what you think is an optimal organizational scale to tackle these problems. So the one small town has a hard time doing it. They start, and you've talked a lot about partnerships. When does it become big enough or broad enough to be effective? And do we need to rethink that in some way? For example, is this a watershed scale problem, or what would you do?
You know, I think it depends on when it provides value to the partners. A partnership is just more than one person working with somebody else. And if you can provide value to your neighbor and they can provide value to you, you just created a successful partnership. If you can provide value to your region, working regionally, that's a successful partnership. And so it depends on, I hate to say it this way, but it depends on what you can get out of it, but it's true. It's also what you can provide. And sometimes there's a little self-sacrifice in that, is that, as a community, we work hard to support our region, even if it's not necessarily in the interests of Newport specifically, but it's in the interests of our community as a member of our region. And so each community and each partner is going to have to weigh that on their own.
And I would say that I would agree completely with what he's saying, because each one of your goals are going to be different. So in some situations, ours is watershed. In economic development, we really look regionally, right? We look through like a 3-county region just because it makes more sense. So up in Detroit and Idana, it's hard for me to even get an email to Idana. And what a partner would look like there was, we have an energy company that really wants to bury lines. Well, wouldn't that be great if we could bury lines and then also add broadband fiber at the same time? So that partnership wouldn't necessarily work in another area where you just don't have those resources. And so really it's kind of being that creative problem solver and communities can do this. The small communities can do this. You just need to find what your resource base is and then actually go after that.
I'd love to give a plug for another, is this on? I'd love to give a plug for another great Oregon program, the RARE program, Resource Assistance for Rural Oregon. And so some of the communities we work with, including the City of Talent, has been able to access this. And it's a person for a year working on different conservation-related projects. And they've been able to span water, waste, energy, and connect local communities together. So if you don't feel like you have the capacity in your own community, you can sometimes find a rare intern to help serve a couple of communities.
Very good. Well, I just want to connect this panel to the activities that we have planned for the rest of the day. So when we're concluded here on the stage, we'll have about half an hour of networking available for you out in the foyer, and then several of these panelists will then take this conversation further into breakout sessions that begin at 11 o'clock and are both downstairs and on this floor. We'll come back to this room at noon for a lunch and program, and I just want to thank all of my colleagues for their time and expertise this morning. This was a great conversation. Thank you so much.